Sexual selection can also serve to act as a reproductive barrier in Sympatric. So Lake Victoria in Africa is a place where ichthyologists, people who study fish, and people who study evolutionary biology are very acutely interested because Lake Victoria has had as many as 600 different species just within this one family of fish, the cichlids. And cichlids are common in the aquarium trade. So we know that there are lots and lots and lots of species of cichlids in this area, and we also know from the geologic history of Lake Victoria that all these species have developed within a very, very short period of time on the evolutionary scale, only about 100,000 years, which is just the blink of an eye. I mean, it is practically nothing at all in terms of evolutionary terms. So a big question is why? Why are there so many different species of fish in this one lake? And there are a number of things going on. One is that Lake Victoria has expanded and contracted through geologic history. So there might be some evidence of allopatric speciation. As the water subsided, it produces smaller sublakes, which would allow allopatric speciation to occur, but that doesn't explain all of it, all of what's going on in Lake Victoria. So another hypothesis is that maybe there is some sexual selection occurring that has driven sympatric speciation. So an experiment was performed with two species of cichlids in the genus Pundamilia. So here's Pundamilia, and here's Pundamilia murarii, hope I'm saying that right, which occur in Sympatric, but they are discrete species. They're recognized as discrete species. And under normal light conditions, these fish look very different. Very different. So what the researchers did is they tried to fool the fish by culturing them, growing them, under a monochromatic orange light. And under this monochromatic orange light, they look a lot more similar. And what they found is that under the normal light conditions, the females would only breed with members of their own species. Under monochromatic orange light conditions, they couldn't necessarily tell whether they were mating with someone of their own species or of the opposite species. A different species. Which suggested that the reason that they were reproductively isolated had more to do with sexual selection than it did with other barriers to reproduction. So it seems like there is sexual selection deriving speciation within these species of fish. So sympatric speciation can also result from different niches. So what we're saying here is that this is essentially like at the fine scale, sort of like very fine scale allopatry. So there's a species of invasive pest called Ragolitis pomonella. Let's see, there's a picture of it. Which is a pest of apples. As it turns out, these flies like to live on apple trees, but there are some that can also grow and live on hawthorn trees. Hawthorn trees are in the same plant family as apples. They're both in the rose family, for your information. And some of these maggot flies will live on the hawthorn trees, and some will live on apple trees. And as they grow and develop on their different plant host, this presents a barrier to reproduction. They have reproductive isolation. Even though you might have a landscape that has both hawthorn and apple trees in it, that choice of host acts as sort of a fine-scale allopatric barrier to reproduction. So we still consider it to be sympatric speciation, even though at the very fine scale what's happening is, I would say, more a case of allopatry. So there's our Ragelitis pomonella that's feeding on a hawthorn berry. You can see it's not a great big fly. It's just that hawthorn berries tend to be pretty small. Okay, so allopatry means different country speciation. It's the more prevalent type, the one that's been better documented. We've seen more instances of it. And what's happening is that there's a geographic isolating factor that's preventing gene flow between populations. It isn't just the geographic isolation that prevents, that drives speciation. There also has to be things like natural selection, genetic drift, sexual selection within those isolated populations that's going to be a true and real barrier, so that eventually it's not just unlikely for them to breed, but it actually becomes impossible for them to breed. So even if contact was restored between some of these populations, they're not going to interbreed because they won't or because they can't. In sympatric speciation, again, the much less commonly observed, probably less frequent form of speciation, a reproductive barrier can occur within a subset of a population that makes that subset become isolated from the parent population. And we've seen how that can occur through things like polyploidy. There can be selective pressures towards sympatric speciation, or we can see sexual selection driving sympatric speciation. All right, but sometimes we do see overlap between species that may have been derived in allopatry. So some of those barriers that may have cropped up to separate two species can go away. Over time, the mountains may crumble, Gibraltar may tumble. They're only made of clay. That's a line from a song. Anyway, geographic barriers can go away, and new species, or relatively new species that have a shared common ancestor, may come into contact again. And it's possible that these reproductive barriers are incomplete. We know that there can be some post-zygotic factors that enable hybrids to be formed, but maybe those hybrids just aren't as fit due to a lack of viability or a lack of fertility as the parents. But a number of things can happen. There's a continuum, a gradient of things that can happen in these hybrid zones. So usually what happens is, as these geographic barriers go away, you find that these novel species will have interaction. And sometimes it can occur along a long, narrow hybrid zone, as we see in this genus Bombina, genus of toads. But more often, it's kind of a patchwork, a mosaic across the landscape, like the dots on a Dalmatian. But this Bombina example provides it's a good example because you have this long, continuous hybrid zone. Okay, so here in yellow is the range of our yellow-bellied toad, Bombina variegata, and over here we've got the fire-bellied toad, Bombina bombina. So here are the ranges of the parents, and then there's this overlapping region, which is the hybrid zone. So these two species share a recent common ancestor, but through some type of allopatry, they are now discrete species. Except in the region where their ranges overlap, they can interbreed and produce hybrids. So why do we still consider them to be discrete species? Well, these hybrids don't seem to have the same fitness as do either of the parent species. And it seems like this hybrid zone isn't really moving in one direction or the other to enable these two species to come back together. So hybrids often have reduced fitness. They either don't survive as well as, or they do not reproduce as well as their parent species. So whenever we have a hybrid zone like this, usually we see one of three things happening. Reinforcement, fusion, or stability. Okay, so say we've got a species, and within this population, within this species, there is gene flow. There is interbreeding going on. And then some barrier to gene flow, say a geographic barrier occurs, and over time, the isolated population is going to diverge and start looking different and start acting differently from the parent population. And then say that barrier collapses or dissolves or goes away or there's a reintroduction, and so you have a hybrid zone. So this barrier to gene flow is gone. But the barrier to reproduction is not great enough that it's just impossible for hybrid offspring to be formed. So what happens? One of three things is going to happen. There can be reinforcement in that hybrid zone. So the hybrids can become their own species, in effect. So the two species can form hybrids, and those hybrids can be as fit in that hybrid zone or more fit than either of the parents and become a novel species. So this is like a form of net-like or reticulate evolution. You can have fusion. So maybe if this barrier is low enough and these two populations are not divergent enough, what we'll find is they're not really two species after all, and that they're just going to fuse back together, and these populations will define the same species that we had back here, or a new and modified form of that new species. So that's fusion. Or there could be stability. It could be that these hybrids are just as fit as either of the parents. They can interbreed with either of the parents. And everybody is sort of interfit with each other, but we can still tell the difference between either of these parent populations and the hybrid population. So that's what we would consider to be a stability situation. So when the hybrids are less fit than their parents, we're going to see reinforcement. And over time, there's going to be fewer and fewer hybrids. I'm not going to go into that. So in fusion, the case is that the hybrids are as fit as the parents, which enables gene flow between the species, and they're going to eventually become just one great big happy species. And then in the case of stability, the gene flow outside the hybrid zone will overwhelm selection for their increased reproductive isolation inside the hybrid zone. So because Bombina species are constantly interacting with each other at these hybrid zones, hybridization is just going to keep on occurring. Okay, so the rate at which speciation occurs, we tend to think of it as being a long and slow process, but we've seen in cases like with polyploidy where you could literally have a new species overnight. So in general, we think that the process is kind of long and takes a long time to develop, but we know that there's a continuum. There's a range of options in terms of how long it takes to define a new species. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to just do one more short little talk, and then we'll be done with Chapter 24 and the semester.